we'll record the session and make it available. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Apologies for the slightly late start, some technical difficulties, and we'll now get underway. My name is Brene Lloyd, and I work with Northwatch, and we are part of We the Nuclear Free North. And I'm joining from my home at the meeting place between the traditional territory of the Algonquins, Kebowek First Nation, and Robinson Huron Treaty Area in northeastern Ontario. And this is an online discussion primarily about the March 18th Ignace hosting agreement, leading into, in the context of the April 26th to 30th online poll for residents of Ignace. And this is a poll where Ignace residents will indicate their support or lack of support for the Township of Ignace proceeding in the NWMO's site selection process. We're expecting a respectful discussion, including comments and questions, both in the webinar mode and on Facebook. And the purpose is to support Ignace residents in considering both the NWMO project and the March 16th hosting agreement as they make their decision. And we'll be giving priority to questions from Ignace. I can't always identify by looking at the registration or the participants, whether you're from Ignace or elsewhere, but we will, to the best of our ability, give priority to questions from people in Ignace, but of course, everyone is welcome to participate. So we have 4 speakers this evening. We've got Teresa McClenahan from Canadian Environmental Law Association, Pippa Feinstein from the Nuclear Transparency Project, Dr. Warren Bernauer from the University of Manitoba Natural Resources Institute, and Lise Morton, the Vice President for Site Selection at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And we're actually going to hear from each speaker in that order, and then we'll move to question and answer. We have circulated to the residents of Ignace some of our observations from our review, initial review of the hosting agreement, and certainly we'd welcome questions in follow-up to that, but in no way is the conversation limited or driven by those observations that we did share in a mail or a mail out to all the residents of Ignace. So I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it over to Teresa. So thank you again to all the participants, to the panelists, and I'll turn it over to Teresa.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brene. And I think the way this is working is that we'll be going from the I have to figure out how to do a full screen. Okay, one sec. Let me just get the PowerPoint to the beginning. It's a night for technical challenges. Okay, that should work better.
So while Teresa's working that out,
there we go. Finally, there is a lag. That's partly what's going on. So for the others, when you're doing your slides, that might be what's the problem. Yeah, so going from the more general to the specific, I am not here tonight to provide legal advice or legal commentary or legal opinions at all. In fact, the slides I'm presenting tonight are slides that came from work we did, research we did a couple of years ago with one of the other communities that was previously involved in the Learn More process. SELA has expertise in assisting communities in participating in decision-making, whether it's by way of licensing or impact assessment or other types of decisions related to hazardous facilities. And that's the context in which I'm speaking tonight. And then I will say a little bit about the roles of the different decision makers. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is that the National Academy of Sciences put out a good report talking about the need to strongly link sound scientific analysis and effective public deliberation. And they talked about very complex choices with varied interests and values, and the fact that the choices are not just scientific and technical, but also political, social, cultural, and economic. And some of the critiques of decision-making processes arise when there's a failure to pay attention to legitimate interests, to take certain concerns into account, if the choices are artificially narrowed, or if certain values are not being included in the analysis, and if different ways of knowing are not accounted for. So some of the concerns and questions people often have is how the affected public is defined. So are the people being consulted the ones who would be most impacted? Are the Indigenous and treaty rights being respected? Are all of the affected communities being consulted, such as transportation route communities? And this is something that came up, for example, in a different environmental assessment process a few years ago around a different deep geological repository, where we contended that the communities on the transportation route and further afield from the immediate community had not been adequately consulted or even defined in the area studied. So that raises the question about what is the geographic definition of the impacted community and the environment, and is that adequate? Also of critical importance is the question of who is making the decision on behalf of the community and on behalf of which community. So looking at municipalities, and you're talking tonight about a process being run by Ignace, municipal jurisdiction over nuclear power regulation is extremely limited. In fact, it's pretty much non-existent. And so municipal land use planning, for example, could be overridden if there was ever a conflict with a decision being made by a nuclear regulatory authority or a federal nuclear authority, because of the way the Constitution divides responsibility in this country. And quite a bit of case law has confirmed that those nuclear decisions, including land use, are federal. Additionally, there are some municipal bylaws, though, that may apply to everyone equally. And so if they're not singling out to apply to the nuclear industry or not in conflict with the federal licensing by the safety regulator, then they would apply normal bylaws that apply to the health and welfare and operation of the community, as long as there's no conflict and as long as they're not singled out to be nuclear. Provincial authorities have some jurisdictions, such as over exploration drilling. You can ignore the reference to the second presentation because that's from a different day. But there could also be provincial rules around permits to take water, air pollution, minerals exploitation that could apply, albeit uranium mining for sure, which is not in question here, is federal as well. And those areas all arise because of provincial jurisdiction over property and civil rights in the province. As between the provinces and territories versus the federal government, as I said, jurisdiction over nuclear power and the related activities is primarily federal. And that's because nuclear power was declared to be a work or undertaking for the general advantage of Canada. And the way the Constitution is divided, that places the responsibility federally. I'll finally mention a couple of slides on the international context. The Joint Convention on the Safety of Spent Fuel Management and the Safety of Radioactive Waste Management are conventions that Canada is party to. Disposal is defined in that convention as placing used fuel or radioactive waste without intending to retrieve it. It requires contracting parties, means the country like Canada that signed on to the convention, to ensure that society, environment, and individuals are adequately protected against radiological hazards. So that would be a responsibility of Canada. And it aims to avoid imposing undue burdens on future generations. And there are a number of different clauses that talk about adequate protection and reasonably practicable improvements and suitable measures. So there's a lot of judgment in that language in the convention, but it does say that the generation of radioactive waste must be kept to the minimum practicable, the generation of radioactive waste. And finally, that radiation exposure to workers and the public must be kept as low as reasonably achievable, economic and social factors taken into account. So those are some things to think about while thinking about a decision-making process. I think the last slide I have here is, what are the questions that people typically would be asking in a hazardous site siting process? And I think for community members thinking about weighing in on the decision in Ignace, it would be a question of whether people feel they have answers to these questions or adequate answers at present around the type of hazard or danger, who could be impacted, how the hazard could occur, what the pathways are, what are the potential health effects if things go wrong, what could be done to prevent the hazard, how could the situation be controlled, and what is the level of confidence people have in the answers they're provided. So I hope that's a little bit helpful, and I know we'll get into more specifics as we go through the rest of the panelists, so I'll stop share.
Thanks very much, Teresa. That was helpful. We're now going to move to Pippa Feinstein. Pippa is with the Nuclear Transparency Project, and one of the observations we had about the hosting agreement was with respect to the confidentiality provisions in the hosting agreement. And Nuclear Transparency Project is an organization focused on open information, open data. And I'm going to turn it over to Pippa. Thanks so much, Pippa.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself before sharing the screen. Okay. So thank you so much for having me and inviting me to contribute to this important conversation. My name is Pippa Feinstein, and I'm the founder and coordinator of the Nuclear Transparency Project. And I'm personally based in Toronto, Treaty 13. In this short 5-minute presentation, I'll briefly introduce my organization. I'll share our definition of transparency, its legal basis, and why it's so important. Our organization is a Canadian registered nonprofit dedicated to supporting open, informed, and equitable public discussion on nuclear energy. We're comprised of an interdisciplinary team that addresses the technical scientific aspects of nuclear energy infrastructure, as well as its legal and regulatory aspects, its economic and financial aspects, and its social aspects, all of which are involved in a variety of nuclear infrastructures across the country. So how do we define transparency? Well, when we think about transparency, we usually think that it comprises of about 2 separate parts. The first relates to procedures or processes. So in this case, for Ignace residents, it would be about what kinds of processes or what steps were there for the public before the municipal agreement was signed, and indeed what steps have there been before a public vote is held on siting. At this step, it's usually a question of access to information. So do members of the public and decision makers have the information they need in order to make an informed decision about all the issues and questions before them? Decisions ultimately have to be informed if they're to be valid and legitimate. Willingness or consent can only be provided if one is aware about what one's agreeing to. More practically, this will require things like enough information about known environmental impacts as well as potential environmental risks, and this is usually communicated through access to environmental data or scientific studies. It will likely include transparency around financial arrangements and compensation, including specific amounts and allowable uses, as well as any financial reporting mechanisms. It's likely to include access to technical information about design features of facilities and any changes to those designs. It may include information about transportation routes, cargo, and any kinds of accidents or transportation events that might impact the public. And it can include things like employment around facilities, both employment terms, whether they're long-term or short-term employment types, employee demographics, so who's being hired, and what kinds of contracts, rates, etc. are being offered. Members of the public need to know about all of these things in order to decide whether these terms are acceptable to them or not. So it's a really important precondition to other things which I'll discuss now. And these are related mostly to outcomes. This is the second part of transparency as we think about it. When we talk about outcome here, what we're really talking about is that when a decision is made or an agreement is signed, it needs to describe all of the issues that were at stake for all of the people involved in the process. And then it needs to demonstrate in a clear way how all of these issues are being weighed against each other. The rationales for decisions or findings or agreement terms need to be transparently disclosed and communicated. And all of these things collectively will work to demonstrate how the thinking or negotiation happens behind the scenes of an outcome, and allows the decision maker or the authorities at play to demonstrate, hopefully, that they haven't chosen a path that's only been dictated by one party or the most powerful party involved in discussions. So that's generally how we think about transparency in these kinds of contexts. Transparency is a very established legal principle. It's at the heart of procedural fairness in a wide variety of areas of Canadian law. It also informs more recent right-to-know legislation. So this is particularly developed in the US, although there are several examples of it in Canada as well. And this right-to-know legislation pops up in a variety of areas as well. But generally, it's environmental related, and it holds that members of the public have a right to know about the health of their communities so that they can make informed decisions about the kinds of advocacy they might want to engage with, but also they can make informed decisions about their activities within their community so that they can take informed measures to protect their own safety. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission also has a mandate, which is sometimes, I think, overlooked, but it's right there in the legislation, that they have positive responsibilities to disseminate objective information. They also have an informal policy where they exempt environmental data from claims of proprietary confidentiality that may be brought by nuclear industry. So I introduced this because I think it forms part of the nuclear regulatory landscape for thinking about transparency and access to information and where regulators should stand. Transparency is also a cornerstone of international agreements related to public decision-making. And I've included here two international agreements, although the first one applies to the EU and the second to Latin America and the Caribbean, but both have very strong articulations of the importance of transparency for environmental decision-making processes. So finally, transparency is not often an end goal in and of itself. As I noted, it's rather a prerequisite or a necessary condition for ensuring things like fairness, accountability, and legitimacy of outcomes and processes. Transparency at the end of the day can't deliver any of these things on its own per se, but none of these things would be possible without transparency. So I'll end my presentation there with the understanding that if there are any questions, I look forward to discussing those on our meeting. But if anyone has any more specific questions, I put my email here as well to continue conversations that way if it's of interest to people as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Pippa. And now we're going to move to Warren. Warren, I've already introduced as a Northwestern boy. Warren is at the University of Manitoba Natural Resource Institute. And Warren is going to walk us through some key points around the impact assessment process. Warren.
Hey, thanks, Bernane. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yep, you're fine.
Okay, great, thank you. So as Bernane said, I'm a research fellow at the University of Manitoba, where my research program focuses on environmental governance and natural resource management, especially environmental assessment processes. I also regularly work as a consultant to municipal governments and Inuit organizations, primarily in Nunavut, around the environmental assessment, usually of major mining projects. I think this is why Bernane's asked me to comment a bit on the environmental assessment provisions of the hosting agreement. So I'll start off by saying a few words about what environmental assessment is, describe a few different types of approach to EA, and then dig in just a little bit into the hosting agreement itself and make a few comments on the sort of implications of it for EA processes moving forward. So what is environmental assessment? An EA, at the end of the day, is a bureaucratic process that the government uses to kind of guide decisions about the environment. Most of the time when we talk about environmental assessment, we're talking about project-specific EA. So this is when there's a specific sort of proposal for a project like a mine or a nuclear waste dump, and the process decides whether or not this proposal should go ahead, and if so, under what conditions. And the way the process works is the proponent, either the mining company or the nuclear company, writes something called an impact statement. And this has all of the studies that they've done, their proposal, their plans for mitigation and monitoring. And this is publicly scrutinized. Government departments, the public, civil society groups make written comments. Usually there's a public hearings where you can make oral comments. And then at the end of the day, the EA panel makes a recommendation, and usually the government makes a decision. So that's project-specific assessment, and that's 99% of EAs that happen in Canada are project-specific like that, focused on a specific mine or waste dump or something like that that's going to be assessed. There's also something called regional environmental assessment and strategic environmental assessment. And these processes are similar. They're both much broader than a project-specific assessment. Regional assessments consider the effects of development on a region, as the name would suggest, whereas strategic assessments look at the effects of a proposed policy. So if the government was going to do something like introduce a carbon tax, they could use a strategic assessment to kind of gauge what the implications of that are likely to be. Now, both strategic and regional assessments come very early in a development process. Usually you carry these out before you start getting specific projects being brought forward. So I hope that background gives a little bit helpful. And I'd just like to make a few kind of quick comments on the NWMO site selection process and how it kind of relates to this, because as somebody who's been observing this for a while, I do have some concerns with how this site selection process relates to the EA process. Like I said, like Bernane said, I'm from Dryden, and so I've been following this with a lot of interest. I still have family in the region, so it's an issue that's quite important to me. And the key thing is there's a risk that this process could short circuit the EA process. What's happening is municipal and Indigenous governments are being asked to consent before an assessment has even begun. And the result is these governments may lack access to the information necessary to make responsible decisions here. And this is because the NWMO's claims about environmental protection and public safety haven't been scrutinized through a public and transparent assessment. These assessment processes are incredibly helpful, in my experience, for helping communities come to a decision about a proposed project. It's not even just the opportunity to speak out and be heard. It's the opportunity to meet with government scientists offline during these meetings and civil society groups and just get more information from different points of view. Find out what different scientists think about the NWMO's reports and come up with a decision on their own. So the fact that this assessment hasn't happened, it really prevents communities from having the full benefit of that a variety of different voices and perspectives on this issue. The other issue is there's significant parts of this proposal that are still quite unclear to me, especially as I read through this hosting agreement, and there's so many provisions around project modifications and changes that gives a fair bit of operational flexibility, which if we saw this in a mining proposal in Nunavut, it would definitely raise red flags for us. So in my opinion, a regional or strategic assessment should have been done before the communities were being asked to declare their willingness. I think that this could have provided an opportunity to have those discussions, and it's unfortunate it hasn't. And this leads me to the hosting agreement itself, which I think risks further kind of short-circuiting this process, because not only is Ignace being asked to declare its willingness, but it seems to be being asked to declare its willingness in perpetuity, right? The hosting agreement kind of stipulates that even if in the future there's more information found out about potential environmental effects, or even if the scope of the project changes significantly, Ignace will seemingly still be legally bound to support the DGR. And the other key concern is that the NWMO seems to have the right to effectively vet in Ignace's written comments to environmental assessment and other regulatory processes. And this could seriously constrain the ability of a municipality and its residents to participate. Like Ignace can only share their concerns with the EA panel after passing them on to the NWMO, and the NWMO has an opportunity to incorporate them into their project documents. Now, it's not clear to me what would happen if the NWMO attempts to incorporate things, but it doesn't do so meaningfully or to the satisfaction of Ignace. I realize there's a fairly complex dispute resolution process, which could, my concern is that it could leave Ignace's concerns caught up in bureaucratic process and prevent them from meaningfully sharing them with an EA panel at the end of the day. So just to conclude, this hosting agreement has provisions that I think are quite concerning. And this is on top of some of the problems with the site selection process. So together, these shortcomings could increase environmental risk and could create problems with public legitimacy when decisions are made moving forward. You know, if I was looking at an agreement like this with a hunters and trappers organization or a municipality in Nunavut, I would strongly recommend them to go back to the table and try and kind of rethink some of these provisions. The way that the municipalities' hands are tied in some of these things could pose problems in the future. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Warren. Now we're going to go. Our fourth panelist is Lise Morton, Vice President of Siting for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. Thanks so much for joining us, Lise, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brené. So on March 18th, as we've all known, of 2024, the Township of Ignace signed a hosting agreement with the NWMO. And this historic agreement is a result of more than 10 years of engagement with Ignace. And we spent that time understanding what was important to the community if they were to move forward with the proposed Deep Geological Repository project. The hosting agreement reflects the unique characteristics and goals of the community, and it outlines financial but also other benefits that Ignace would experience over the 170-year span of the project. And these are benefits that would be felt by many generations of people living and working in the area. This hosting agreement marks an important milestone in the process of site selection for a DGR to safely contain and isolate Canada's used nuclear fuel for the long term. And while it's an important milestone, the hosting agreement does not indicate that the community is willing to host the project. That willingness decision will come through a community-led willingness process, and we expect to have Ignace's willingness decision around the end of June. And in the Northwestern Ontario siting area, a willingness decision will also be made by Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation, in whose traditional territory the proposed project would be sited. This agreement reflects the goals and priorities of the community and the importance of celebrating Ignace's small town charm, which is a feature which is highlighted in the agreement principles. As with all agreements, one of our goals is to advance community well-being in line with the community's priorities. And in the agreement, there are commitments to invest in a range of programs, including youth training, municipal housing study, a tourism strategy, and to facilitate local employment opportunities. One of the first ways the project will come to life, if sited in the area, would be the Center of Expertise, a facility that we've been talking about in the community for several years. The center would be the anchor for the entire project, would create high-value jobs, and is expected to attract visitors from around the world. We are already seeing interest from around the world on the siting process. Consistent with the NWMO's commitment to protect people and environment, the agreement also recognizes the community's strong connection to the outdoors and natural resources, and the importance of being environmental stewards who protect and enhance the local and surrounding area. The agreement also outlines the scope of the project, what types of used nuclear fuel and other types of nuclear waste could be safely stored in the repository. I want to stress that the agreement states that the DGR would not contain liquid fuel waste and would only contain Canada's used nuclear fuel. It would not accept any other country's used nuclear fuel. The agreement outlines the financial benefits that would come to Ignace if they were to host this project. And communities that agree to host significant infrastructure projects have the right to benefit from doing so, especially a project like this that government and industry have recognized as critical to achieving its climate change objectives, as well as critical to the safety of all Canadians and Indigenous peoples. If this project was sited in the Ignace area, it would bring enormous economic benefits. Depending on the phase of the project, it would bring between 400 and 700 new jobs to the area, jobs that would last for generations. The population of Ignace is expected to double to over 2,000 people, and we have heard from Ignace residents that this growth is what is most exciting. We've also heard from Ignace residents how a project like this makes them hopeful that their children and grandchildren will be able to remain in the area. They want to see Ignace grow and thrive into the next century, and bringing in hundreds of new residents will help with that. I want to close by stating that protecting people and the environment is NWMO's top priority. The project will not move forward until the federal regulators, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, after careful review of all the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic studies, approve the project. And they must indicate that it can be carried out safely and meet the strict safety standards that is part of every nuclear facility. As outlined in the agreement, the Township of Ignace would continue to have a significant voice in the project through the establishment of an ongoing implementation committee that will continue through all phases of the project. And nothing in the agreement prevents individual residents of Ignace to participate in those public hearings and to voice their concerns and raise questions. Finally, to support the community in its willingness process, we will be maintaining our Ignace Learn More Center open from 9 to 7 every day during the voting period for the community, which is from April 26th to April 30th. We understand that people have questions, and we encourage residents to please drop by and ask those questions, and we can also connect them with technical experts as needed. So thank you for having me tonight. Back to you, Brene.
Great, thanks very much, Lise. We're now going to move. That was excellent. I think we heard from a very nice, diverse set of speakers, and lots of new thoughts and information and analysis brought to the discussion. We've got, the questions are starting to come in. So I'm going to remind the panelists that if there's a question they'd like to answer, they can indicate that in the question and answer section. Otherwise, I might just arbitrarily assign. So the first question is a bit aside from this. Why are NWMO reports, including test results, no longer available and accessible on the NWMO website? I'm no longer able to access the NWMO website at all. So I think that, I don't know if Lise, if you want to answer that, if that, it's an anonymous, so I can't identify who it is. If you'd like to send a question, send an email to either myself at Northwatch or to contact us at nwmo.ca. We can work that out with you because the website has changed. I also find it more difficult to find documents that used to be easier to have brought to the surface. But I can walk you through it, and I hope that NWMO would do the same. So thank you for that, raising that though. Question from Jeff. Is it normal practice for a project such as the NWMO to have a 10-year learning community consultation process? Given the multitude of community studies already completed, the echoed parameters found in EAs, that echoed parameters found in EAs, what other information is required that would need to be addressed? What learning mechanisms are included for typical impact assessment, as well as timeline for public consultation? I'm going to open that up. I think any of our panelists would have something to say. Warren, do you want to start us off on that one?
Sure, just let me pull it up here. It's kind of a long question. So is it normal to have this 10-year lead-up learning consultation process? No, and it's helpful that the NWMO has engaged with the public, but that was kind of besides the point of what I was making. It's not necessarily that I can't say off the top of my head which other studies would be required. Again, this is the benefit of an impact assessment process, is it can identify these gaps, send the proponent back to do more work until we can be sure that things are comprehensive. This isn't something that we can arrive at just by talking about over a webinar. And part of it isn't even so much about what gaps need to fill or what information isn't there when it comes to the studies. It's also just about having these studies critically scrutinized. I did mention some lack of information about the project that was unclear. I think that if we just go through the hosting agreement and look at the sort of operational flexibility that it provides, that's kind of a major source of concern alone right there, that there's space to kind of change and alter the project after consent has been given, and seemingly very little, few mechanisms for recourse for the municipality. So typical impact assessment processes, learning mechanisms. Well, that depends significantly on the impact assessment process you're speaking about. The Nunavut Impact Review Board that I usually work with in Nunavut has some pretty extensive learning mechanisms, whether it's the public engagement sessions in the lead up to more formal meetings. They hold community roundtable meetings quite frequently associated with their formal hearing processes. So there's actually a very extensive learning mechanisms in the Nunavut process. And the timelines for public consultation, that varies so much from assessment to assessment. I don't think I could give an answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. I think the heart of Jeff's question is, what's the added value for an impact assessment over the information exchange that has been underway for the last several years in Ignace and in other communities? I don't know if I'm itching to have a go at it, but I'm going to defer to the panelists. Pippa or Teresa, do you want to weigh in on that, or Lise?
I think Lise does, and then I would make a couple comments as well.
Go ahead, Lise.
Thanks, Teresa. I don't know how to do the raise hand feature, even though you explained it. Apologies. So a couple of things, and I'm going to pull up the question as well. So going through the impact assessment process actually would, I believe, achieve many of the things that Warren is talking about. So we would have to continue, once we select a site, that's just the beginning of then moving into the impact assessment process. And we would have to then complete detailed site characterization, even beyond what we have already done in both of the siting areas. So there would be additional geoscientific studies, there would be additional environmental baseline monitoring and environmental studies, and all of those studies would then be brought forward in front of the regulator. We already do get very much of our geoscientific and our environmental work peer reviewed right now, but exactly to Warren's point, as you would then go through the impact assessment, those things would go through even further scrutiny. They would get even further reviewed, peer reviewed, independent reviewed, and that process also then would bring in the technical expertise that we need from whether it's different government agencies that might be involved as well on the other parts of the project. So we've seen this in previous public hearings that have been done on obviously a similar DGR. And I think it's very important to stress that if we do not achieve a successful impact assessment, then there is no project. There's no provisions in here to be able to continue with the project. So you really do need collectively for NWMO to demonstrate to the satisfaction of regulators that we have met their requirements, and for them to then approve the project, and eventually for the federal minister to approve the project. So there's a very lengthy time to go through that entire process. And the last thing I'll just say to the question here about learning mechanisms. So the engagement that we are already doing with the community and the regional communities and the neighboring communities, that would continue throughout the impact assessment. And there would be many opportunities for public consultation and public engagement and input into some of the design parameters and some of the facilities that we would be building.
Great, thanks, Lise. Teresa.
Yes, so in addition to those good sets of comments, I'll mention a couple of other things that are different about an impact assessment and extremely valuable about an impact assessment. So for example, in Canada, matters that are going through an impact assessment are placed on a registry for transparency purposes, to Pippa's point. And you can then find all of the documents that are being submitted for the decision. You know where to find them. They're maintained there. They're archived there. Usually as well in these nuclear-based environmental assessments, major assessments, we've had some type of an interrogatory process where the members of the public and interveners can ask questions of the proponent, and the panel involved in the impact assessment can make sure those questions get answered. It's also important because impact assessment provides for other perspectives to be tabled. So it's not just a kind of a binary proponent and not proponent. There's a whole range of other perspectives that are tabled. And again, dealing with impact assessment in Canada at present, as well as the nuclear licensing process, we do have funding arrangements and the opportunity for members of the public or organizations to retain independent experts and examine the various issues that people are concerned about. And that independence and that sort of peer review is extremely important for a credible decision-making process. So while I think Lisa's point about there's an open house and people are there to answer questions, that's terrific, but that absolutely is not independent. And so, you know, environmental assessment processes allow a way to have a number of different perspectives really thoroughly canvassed.
Great, thanks, Teresa. Pippa, did you want to weigh in or give it a pass?
Sure, I can briefly weigh in. I had a few thoughts, but one of them is relating, I think, to timeframes, because our organization's been involved with some other quite large projects that have had reviews spanning many years, but are often on hold on and off throughout that time. And there's sometimes unequal notice about exactly where a process is in a regulatory review. So the 10 years in and of itself isn't necessarily evidence of very close negotiations and discussions. I think at the end of the day, it would be the real substance and quality of the content that would determine the depth of consultation. The other point I wanted to make related to information gaps and the potential to identify information gaps in a public record for a review or a proceeding. And here, really, the more perspectives there are, the more comprehensive the record is going to be. So ensuring broad public participation from the start and throughout a process where all people, all sort of sectors of society are represented is really key. And this also relates to any sort of confidentiality or secrecy that might be involved in these kinds of deliberations. The more people who are involved, the more opportunities there are to challenge the basis for confidentiality provisions when they are raised, whether it's at the municipal level or whether it's in technical reports before other regulators. And finally, this goes to also a point that Teresa was making relating to public support or support for public interventions. both of the international agreements that I referenced in my slides, when they're talking about access to information and public participation, also make explicit note, especially the Escazú agreement, that when members of the public are engaging in a process, they need to have funding and they need to have other sources of support to ensure that they can provide a rigorous review from their own perspectives of what's available on the public record. So that takes time, it takes resources, and that needs to be an important factor to consider as well.
Great, thanks, Pippa. And excellent comments from all the panelists. I'll just add that, Jeff, an important difference between the process to date and an impact assessment process is the impact assessment starts with the project description. And what we have right now to date are concept reports. We've got conceptual designs for transportation, for the DGR, for the used fuel packaging plant. So first step in the impact assessment is a project description, then a very detailed impact assessment statement, what used to be an environmental impact statement. I wonder if it's called an impact assessment statement, and supporting technical documents. So a very different state of information and details an actual description of the project. So thanks very much for that. We have a question from, I'm scrolling down to see if we got some more Ignace resident questions. A question from Angela. Why do only residents of Ignace have the opportunity to choose, not other residents? And I know Angela's not a resident in Ignace, but we've heard this question from Ignace residents many times. So why are only residents of Ignace included in the online poll for the next few days? Why is Ignace identified as a host community, given that there are other communities more proximate to the DGR site? So, Lise, go ahead.
I think most are aware of that NWMO's siting process that launched in and about 2010 was a voluntary process, and municipalities and communities could put their hand up, if you will, to learn more. And Ignace was actually the first community to do so, if you go back and look at the order in which that happened. And so we've been working with Ignace, as I said, for over 10 years now. And we have always said that in order to make the site selection decision, that we needed to have demonstrations of willingness from both the municipality and from the First Nation in whose traditional territory the repository would be located. So that's why we're looking for willingness demonstrations from Ignace and Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. But I think it is important to stress that, and we've been talking a lot about the impact assessment, we fully understand that once we get into an impact assessment, that we will absolutely have to look at a regional impact and the regional voices as well. So there will be opportunity through the process as well for regional voices to bring forward their questions, their concerns, their positions on the project. So it's not that there's not an ability at a later stage, but for the initial site selection decision, Ignace is still the closest municipality to the site. They put their hand up back in, again, in the early years. And again, we've always said from a corporate perspective that we sought the willingness from both the municipality and the First Nation in whose traditional territory the repository would be located.
Thank you, Lise. Would any other panelists like to add to that? We have a question from Paul, specifics around some of the facilities included, the hardening plant included in the surface facilities. I think we'll defer on that for now, Paul, simply because we're not talking specifics of those specifics of the project. Question from Dodie. Lise, will NWMO create and pay for a housing project in Ignace at no cost in the municipality? Other new residents will choose to live in Dryden. This is a question specific to Lise. Lise, maybe you could talk about this in the context of the 10 million cap on discretionary spending or discretionary benefits, I think it was called, that's in the hosting agreement, and the, the range of financial benefits.
So we structured the agreement with Ignace so that there were upfront benefits, and there are several significant milestone payments as well. And as you mentioned, Brene, there's a provision in the agreement up to $10 million as well to support the municipality to be able to prepare for housing. So we are trying to help the municipality, for example, if they need to run infrastructure, water, sewer, electrical, those kinds of things, to set up subdivisions, to prepare for housing, that they have sufficient dollars to help prepare for that. And we do understand that when we did workforce studies, both in this area and in the other prospective area in South Bruce, we do understand that the labor shed will come from a distance. And so there is a recognition that there will be impact on housing regionally, but certainly specific to Ignace, we are trying to provide them support so that they can, again, develop the infrastructure they need, that we could work with developers to make sure that you have construction companies willing to come to the area and build, and that you can really prepare for housing so that again, you do attract many of the employees and workers to come to the area. So we're not going to be building houses. NWMO clearly is not a company that's going to be out there building houses, but we are trying to provide support to the communities so that they can prepare for the housing that they require.
Thanks, Lisa. And so just to be clear to Dodie's question, that funding is within that discretionary fund of $10 million.
There's that, and plus, again, if the community and if the municipality wanted to use some of their other milestone payments or annual payments towards that, there's ability to do that as well.
All right, thank you. A question from Kathleen. What is a similar deep geological repository Lise mentioned? I don't know. Lise?
Well, either Brene or I can no, what I was referring to was that there had been a previous project proposed for a DGR for low and intermediate level waste by Ontario Power Generation. And that was going to be located at the Bruce site, but that project did not proceed. But it is well, it was one of the longest, it may not still be the longest, but it was one of the longest public hearings, I believe, in Canadian history, with 32 or 33 days of public hearings. So it was quite a substantial hearing. So we have some experience from that. And again, Brene and I all got to know each other well over that experience.
Yeah, actually, I think the Seaborn hearing was 13 months. I don't remember. Teresa might weigh in on how long the demand supply plan hearing was. But it was 33 days, it's true. Another question from Jeff. Given the timeline of the agreement, 172 years, the corporate structure for both the NWMO and the municipality will likely change through government reforms over that time period. We've seen regional amalgamations, restructuring in our lifetime. Should a municipal structure change, absorb, be eliminated, or these organizations, should the agreement become null and void and have to be renegotiated? Lise.
I don't know if I have that answer exactly to my, I'm trying to look through the agreement. We did recognize that there could be structural changes, I believe, in the agreement, but I'd have to look for the exact clause. But obviously, and there are many many lawyers on the call here, but to my understanding, it is a contractual agreement between NWMO as an organization and the Township of Ignace. I believe, though, I thought there were successor provisions in here, but I'd have to try to pull them out.
Yeah, and I'm just looking to see if I can find the section. There is a section that refers to successors, and it does bind in amalgamation, as specifically mentioned. It does bind future assignees, might be the term. Jeff, I'll try and find it and put the section in the chat. Question from Angela. Oh, I think we had that one already. A question for Dodie, from Dodie. Lise, under what circumstances will the option clause to have temporary shallow storage at the central site be imposed? You stress that this option clause will not be used, but it appeared in adaptive phase management documents for over 2 decades. Jody, I'm going to give Lise the option of answering that
I can
because it
answer.
is related, but it's actually not part of the hosting agreement. Go ahead, Lise, if you're open to that.
Yeah, I can answer that. So if you go back, many years when NWMO was first looking at what process they should follow, and also doing technical studies in terms of options, one of the options that was looked at was temporary shallow storage at the facility. And it continues to appear in documents, but that's simply to reflect that there was a historical option presented as one of the options. I believe we've said many times that we have no intent. We're not planning. We're not designing for temporary shallow storage at the facility. And you'll see in the hosting agreement that when it talks about the scope of the project, let me back up a step. Typically, things like temporary shallow storage might be something you would use, for example, for low-level waste. So you can see that in the scope of the project, it does talk about including the small volume of low and intermediate level waste that you might produce in the facility itself. Could go in the DGR at the end, well, possibly at the end of operations or sometime during those operations. But a long answer to say that we're not intending to move forward on central shallow storage at the facility. It remains in a lot of our documentation just to reflect the historical option that had been there.
Great. Warren, go ahead. Want to add to that?
Just to be clear, Lise, the agreement does provide for the NWMO to store temporarily different types of waste at the storage site beyond just spent fuel. Is that correct?
Again, there is the ability to store some volumes of low and intermediate level waste. So the facility is going to have in particular some surface facilities, and in particular a used fuel packaging plant. And so you will generate, and I think we need to be very clear so the community understands that you will generate small volumes of low and intermediate level waste through the operations at the surface mostly. And so there is ability for some some storage of that waste at the surface. But again, the intent would be that as best as you can reprocess and process that material. And for example, there is ability in already in the province now, who knows where that will be in 50 years for things like incineration and reprocessing of low and intermediate level waste. I want to be very clear, not about the fuel. So yes, there is provision for some on-site storage of low and intermediate level waste that you're generating through the operations. That doesn't mean you're bringing in other low and intermediate level waste. It's for what's being produced right there.
Warren, did you? So I think Lise and I'm handicapped trying to find the sections as I also try to moderate, but my recollection is that there is under the modification of scope that there is the option of adding additional waste types, not just SMR waste, but there was a more general, the language was more general than that under modification of scope.
Yeah, it says that the municipality acknowledges and agrees that the NWMO shall have the right from time to time to emplace to use nuclear fuel in the DGR from sources other than the accepted fuel sources. So it seems to be a pretty general, and it says including SMRs, but it seems to be a pretty general statement around giving you a lot of operational flexibility, which is one of my key concerns about how this process is working moving forward. And this does come out of my experiences in Nunavut, where we've seen mining proponents use adaptive management or some variation on that, and the flexibility that it provides to drastically change their mitigation measures right after a project is approved. We've seen companies promise to shut down access roads when caribou migrate through the area. And as soon as they get their permit, they say, well, you know what? That's actually really not profitable. That's cutting into our bottom line. So we're just going to keep running trucks, haul trucks through this migration corridor during migration season. So I have to say that statement there is really a red flag for me.
Thanks, Warren. Lise, were you wanting to add an additional comment?
Yes, I think it's very important to state a couple things about the scope. So when we submit an initial project description to the regulator, we will have to be very clear about what that scope is. And of course, obviously the impact assessment, or in the old days, the EA, will bound that scope. And similarly, when we seek an operating license from the regulator, and quite possibly, I'm not sure, maybe even at the construction license stage, but certainly at the operating license stage, we'll have to be very clear about what that scope is. So I don't want it to sound as though the NWMO can get an agreement from the community and then just start putting whatever it wants in the facility. That's simply not the case. There will be strict conditions under the licenses that we have to adhere to. And the last thing I just want to say is that both at during the impact assessment, and then we have to seek 3 different licenses from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission: a license to prepare the site, a construction license, and an operation license. Every one of those regulatory decisions is going to bring with it very stringent conditions, and I'm not aware in the nuclear industry that we can just kind of say, well, we said that that's what the condition was going to be, but we're now not going to do it. But I'm just saying, I think those conditions will be very clear and very stringent. And again, referring back to the example of the OPG DGR that didn't go ahead, my recollection is the panel report that came through on the EA on that had well over 200 conditions, if I remember correctly. So, you would see those kinds of conditions played forward. So it's not just a carte blanche. There's going to be a limit on what scope can be put in. And then if we then need to seek regulatory approval for additional scope, then we would have to go through that regulatory process to do so.
Go ahead, Warren. Thanks, Lise. Warren, and then I'm going to either make a comment or ask Teresa to make it. Warren.
Thanks, Brene, and thank you, Lise. That was really helpful. I guess maybe where you and I differ on our opinions here, well, I recognize that you will need to have a firmer scope for the regulatory process. Like you said, you can go back and apply for amendments and modifications, whereas this agreement that if Ignace ratifies it, they won't be able to change their position on things. You get a lot of flexibility, whereas they seem to be pretty much have their hands tied as these processes move forward. So I'll leave it at that.
So I just want to touch base, though, on the modification of scope that we witnessed in the Deep Geological Repository for Low and Intermediate Level Waste. We call it DGR1, which Teresa, Lise, and I were all part of that review. And if my memory serves me right, and I think it does, the application was for a DGR for operating waste. And a few months before the hearing began, it was disclosed as a separate regulatory process that OPG actually intended to also include decommissioning waste. But the hearing went forward on the basis of the operating waste with a statement that there would be an amendment sought to the license after that environmental assessment was complete. Teresa or Lise, if either of you want to make that recollection a little sharper, but
well, there were additional questions posed by the panel to Ontario Power Generation to elaborate on the other kinds of waste that could be cited. And it was a matter of considerable concern for the interveners, for sure, that the additional types of waste were not included in the original project description and in all of the processes that go with that around assessment, around terms of reference, around values. I think the panel attempted to resolve that by asking for additional information from OPG prior to the conclusion of the hearing, particularly by the end of the second year. Not a satisfactory process in my point of view at all. That you really need full disclosure of the full scope of the project. And certainly by the time you're putting a license application or an environmental assessment and a license application forward.
Thanks. Lise, go ahead.
So the only thing I would just add is, so of course, we've all heard the announcements that have been happening across Canada from various provincial jurisdictions, from various proponents in some case in the industry, and all of the discussion that's happened about small modular reactors. So we understand that there are these potential projects that could come, but the scope as defined in the hosting agreement is fairly narrow in its range in terms of what the willingness decision is based on. And what's also important to understand is that in the case of, for example, many of these small modular reactors, the fuel would not come, if it was to come at all, for many decades. And so we recognize that we still would have to do engagement with communities. In some cases, we don't even know which projects will go ahead and which ones won't. And communities would need to understand what type of fuel we're talking about for some of these potential projects, what the impact could be on both the surface facilities and the underground. So we recognize there would be significant engagement with that would have to happen with communities. And so again, the scope is intended to be limited in narrow in its scope, because we don't know what these future projects are going to look like. But we recognize they could come, that there could be a project scope mechanism. But again, there would be both regulatory processes that would have to kick in and an engagement with the public.
Great. Thanks, Lise. We're at 8:17 and we're aiming to wrap up for 8:30. So I'm going to do a quicker run through the questions, and I'm going to ask people to be succinct in their answer. I will refrain from adding. I'm going to go to a few people who we haven't heard from yet. A question, out of curiosity, has the regulator, the CNSC, ever rejected a license before? A little bit out of scope of the hosting agreement. Maybe a very rapid response from Teresa, Pippa, or Lise.
Yeah, I can think of one case we were involved in for a facility, an operating facility in Renfrew, and the facility was not permitted to operate for a year because of impact on the surrounding environment from tritium emissions. So that was one example.
Great, thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Lisa, jump in.
I was just going to add that the one example, but it's not, again, rejection of a license, but I certainly remember working at Bruce. I can't quote the exact year, but there was in the 90s for sure. And there was a period of time where the CNSC imposed, if I recall correctly, a 6-month operating license on Bruce because there were requirements to make some changes and improvements to that facility. So the regulator certainly has the ability to impose very small, short licenses if they're not satisfied with performance, and obviously they have other abilities as well to put restrictions on licensees.
Thanks. Another question, again for Lise. Why were Ignace residents, and this I'm gonna, if you choose to answer this, Lise, answer it very generally about the process for developing the hosting agreement. The question is, why were Ignace residents not permitted a voice in the latest agreement with the NWMO? The public was not aware of the contents of the agreement until the time of the signing.
So the municipality or the township is not here today, and they're not participating, and I really cannot speak on their behalf. But I think it's important to note that we did have other things leading up to the hosting agreement, for example, that were absolutely made public. So, for example, there was a memorandum of understanding that was signed with the township. Trying to remember exactly the date. I apologize. While of course you're having commercial discussions between two parties, and so you can't always bring everybody in on that. Certainly we tried to be as open as we could when we could. And again, I can't speak on behalf of the process that the township followed.
Thanks, Louise. Question for Jeff. Who would be representatives of the implementation committee as discussed in the agreement, and how are they selected? What role do they play? So people might recall from reading the agreement, there's an implementation committee, 2 from NWMO, 2 from the municipality. Lise, do you want to speak to the mechanics of that?
Yeah, and there's quite a bit of detail, I believe, in Schedule C. Obviously the township could nominates their candidates who they would wish to be participating in that committee. From an NWMO perspective, we anticipate that at least one of those participants would be somebody at, quite frankly, either the director or the VP level, so that we have somebody with a certain level of authority being able to answer questions and make decisions as required. And so, the intent is that committee really can work together to, and I do want to raise something I think was mentioned earlier. There is absolute ability for the township to continue to raise concerns and to work with NWMO on questions and issues that they may have. So this does not mean the township can never raise concerns. They absolutely still can do that. And, the intent of the implementation committee, and of course, those who may be familiar with operations around, let's say, the Darlington plant or the Pickering plant, there are community advisory committees in place around those facilities as well. So the intent is to have an ongoing relationship with the township throughout the phases of the project, so that you always can have that open dialogue, and be hearing concerns, and so that the township is always aware of what's going on with the project, and has provided timely updates on any matters of urgency.
So, Lise, maybe you could speak to the question around the implementation committee. One of the other features of it is that it operates in confidence. It's a confidential discussion within the implementation committee. The implementation committee is also the sort of the decider around the communication strategy and so on. If the Township of Ignace was receiving feedback now that the agreement is available, if the Township of Ignace was receiving feedback from the residents that there was discomfort with either the structuring of the agreement, the requirements for confidentiality, or other aspects, it just, when we're talking about the implementation committee, it comes to me. Built into the agreement is a signing bonus for a decision delivered by June 30th, a expectation that the township will strive to deliver the decision by the end of July, and by the end of September, an opt-out clause for the NWMO, not for the municipality, if the municipality doesn't deliver its decision. If the municipality came back to the NWMO with a yes but or a no unless kind of position or response based on what they hear between now and the time that they deliver the decision, is there the opportunity for then the township and the NWMO to renegotiate aspects of the hosting agreement, given what the town hears from their residents between now and either June 30th, July 30th, or September 30th?
The intent is not to renegotiate the agreement. The intent is certainly that, of course, the township can continue to hear concerns and questions from their residents. And I don't want to speak on behalf of the willingness process, but I know those consultants are also, if they can receiving questions when they speak to residents and collecting those. But no, the intent is not to renegotiate the agreement. We believe the agreement is a strong agreement, a very fair agreement. We believe it provides many provisions, as you can see through the agreement, for exit scenarios, delay, all of those things. So, ultimately, for example, if the township and its residents decided that they did not want to support the project, then there are exit provisions there. So, the intent is not to renegotiate, but again, there are opportunities to hear concerns ongoing and questions ongoing through the process. And as I mentioned earlier, during the impact assessment, of course, residents and community members can still continue to participate and raise concerns and raise questions as well.
Thanks, Lee. And Jeff has added a clarification that his question was around what sectors would actually be represented on the implementation committee, and do they have a role to play in the EA process? I'm going to invite Lise to speak to that, and I'm going to put up our final slides and close the session, at least the formal part of the session. Go ahead, Lise.
Yeah, I was trying to read the question at the same time. So again, NWMO won't dictate who the township puts on. So that would be a question really for the township of who they intend on putting on the implementation committee. And in terms of are they there to oversee, they're really there fundamentally to oversee the hosting agreement and to work with NWMO on this, but it is meant to be an inclusive process. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Thanks, Lise. Now I can't tell if am I sharing my slides or am I sharing my background screen?
You have a slide that says Ignace with Town Hall willingness on the right.
I'm going to stop my share and go again. So we're going to close. Maybe I won't share my slides. What I'll bring them up, but I'm going to close because I know some of our panelists has to leave us at 8:30. So I'm going to thank the panelists very much. Thank the participants for the questions. We're going to close the web session, close the recording, and if some want to and are able to stay on for additional discussion, that would be great. But I do want to just try and share these slides. And so this is just a reminder that what we have and I'm doing a poor job technically, but a reminder that the willingness agreement is available on the township's website. If you go to ignace.ca and click on the upper right, you'll find it. Or you can go to the specific URL that's displayed on the screen. And the engagement team is at the arena Friday through till Monday. If any are having technical difficulties accessing the online poll, registering, or using the poll itself, you can go to the arena. You can also call the number that's on the bottom of the screen. That is the consultant's number, and they will assist. So I want to thank you all very much. I'm going to stop my share, or maybe I'm not. So I'll leave that up for now. So thank you all very much. Thank you for your patience through our technical challenges. And we're now going to stop the recording, and those who choose to stay on can do so. So thanks very much.
Thanks all. And I'm going to have to head out, but appreciate